Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone around the world. Thank you so much for joining us today for this seminar on the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and all of the economic distribution changes we can expect. IFPRI is delighted to be hosting, and I am thrilled to be your moderator. My name is Julie Kurtz. I am a research analyst with the Markets, Trades, and Institutions Division at IFPRI. In just a few days, African countries will begin implementing the much anticipated African Continental Free Trade Area, creating the largest contiguous free trade area in the world. Today, our presenters will discuss how this agreement will change trade flows, and African agricultural production, food supply chains, as well as how these changes will be distributed with impacts on regional poverty, livelihood changes, and food security. We are thrilled to have you join us today. We encourage you to submit questions throughout the event. You can do that on the website directly on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. I am delighted to introduce our first speaker, Nalishebo Meebelo, who is a senior program coordinator at the Regional Network of Agricultural Policy Research Institutes, ReNAPRI, who will introduce our seminar.
Thank you, Julie. It's a pleasure to be a part of this really interesting discussion for the African continent. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you participants from wherever you may be, and a warm welcome to this webinar, which is focused, as Julie said, on the African Continental Free Trade Area, popularly known as the AfCFTA. And today's webinar will be asking a very pertinent question: how will economic distribution change as a result of the AfCFTA? So this event, of course, is being organized and hosted by the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI, in collaboration with the African Continental Task Force on Food and Nutrition Security Data and Hunger Hotspots in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Quite a mouthful there. That's what COVID does to us. So other collaborators for this webinar today include the World Bank, who are part of the task force that I just introduced, and UNECA, also known as UNECA, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. And they will be joining IFPRI in delivering interesting presentations today concerning the AfCFTA. So I've been introduced already by Julie. I am from ReNAPRI, the Regional Network of Agricultural Policy Research Institutes, and our network members are national agricultural policy research centers based in Central, East, Southern, and West Africa. And our research interests include operationalization of the AfCFTA. How interesting is that? Value chain analysis, the economy of fertilizer, and matters relating to resilience. This is among others. So together with Dr. Antoine Bouet, who is on this webinar with us, I co-chair the Task Force on Food and Nutrition Security Data and Hunger Hotspots during the COVID-19 pandemic. This task force was launched under the auspices of the Regional Food Trade Coalition, which is hosted by AGRA, the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. Some of you may recall that the Regional Food Trade Coalition was launched in September last year in Accra, Ghana, during the AGRF. And this was at a time when COVID-19 was completely unknown. So the objectives of the Regional Food Trade Coalition have obviously had to change over time, and hence the launch of this task force that Antoine and myself co-chair at the moment. And the main purpose of the task force is to coordinate the collation and sharing of timely and credible data, information, knowledge products, and best practices concerning the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on food trade, food and nutrition security, on resilience of value chains, as well as on mitigation interventions that are being taken by different actors, including our national governments, as well as other national, regional, and international organizations. So regional trade is at the heart of this task force, and The task force also looks at shared data, the importance of sharing data as institutions that are working within the same space, and also doing inventories of knowledge products and best practices that are expected to support evidence-based planning and implementation of appropriate measures at the level of our national governments, but also at regional level and continental level. The task force also further seeks to identify gaps and regularly update information in a collaborative fashion. And this is why, you know, the task force brings together various actors, including development partners, think tanks in the continent, private sector. They are all part of this task force. The task force secretariat is based at Agra. And so I want to use this opportunity to invite participants who feel that they could contribute to this task force to please get in touch with the secretariat at Agra and declare your interest so that you can join us if you meet the criteria to be part of this task force. So this webinar today is a second among the activities that members of the task force have been undertaking, including IFPRI, who have organized this webinar today. And we will do this regularly as members of the task force using various tools to disseminate data and information to our national governments and other key stakeholders on how best to deal with issues around regional food trade. The first activity, which is almost complete, is a comprehensive evidence synthesis of policy responses to the COVID-19 pandemic by our national government in Africa. And I'm sure this will interest a lot of participants. The final report will interest a lot of you who are in the audience. And this is work that was funded by USAID and AGRA, and is being implemented by experts from ReNAPRI, from the network of ReNAPRI and the University of Washington. So today's webinar speaks to the AfCFTA and provides perspectives from 3 institutions. And your comments, your questions, your general contributions will be welcome because they will assist presenters and their teams to further hone their final product. So as we are all aware, and as Julie earlier said, every one of us is waiting for the operationalization of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, which I believe is expected to create the largest free trade area in the world, measured by the number of participating countries. The agreement covers 1.3 billion people across 55 African countries, with a combined gross domestic product valued at United States dollars 3.4 trillion. This is according to the World Bank. We are told that the AfCFTA has the potential to lift 30 million people out of extreme poverty. So we are waiting to see this happen. And we are also being told that agreements are only as good as the tools that are available to ensure their successful implementation. This AfCFTA will require tools to ensure that it is successful. It is therefore important to ensure that our governments put in place significant policy reforms and trade facilitation measures in order to ensure that this agreement achieves its full potential. So I look forward to an interesting conversation today. And this is following, of course, 3 very rich presentations from our colleagues, IFPRI, the World Bank, and UNECA. And so without much ado, allow me to congratulate and thank IFPRI for organizing this event and for allowing the task force to share your space. I now hand over to Julie to continue with the moderation of this webinar. And Julie, you are the research analyst and chair of the Sustainability Task Force at IFPRI. So I thought I should introduce you because you introduced me. So over to you, Julie.
Thank you so much, Nalishebo. First of all, we are honored to have you on this presentation, and no one could have presented just how important the AfCFTA is for the continent of Africa, and setting the stage so well for the rest of the speakers. So I'm delighted to present next David Laborde, who is a senior research fellow at IFPRI. David.
Thanks, Julie, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We already had the perfect introduction for this session. Now I am going to try to go more deeper in some of the key aspects of this agreement, and in particular for what's going to come in the next couple of months is the opening of some markets with the removal of existing tariff barriers in particular. And I'm going to try to see what it means for agricultural markets. But I will also start by saying why it's so important to have it now. Next slide, please. So this process has actually started at least clearly in 2014. There was discussion before, and it took place in a longer set of events that will lead to a deeper economic integration of the African continent. Now, on January 1st, what we should see is the beginning of the removal of some tariffs on intra-African trade relation. Let me start by saying that, there is already a large number of trade flows that do not face tariffs, because in the last 15 years, 20 years, or a bit more for some sub-regions, we have seen this regional integration process taking place in West Africa, in East Africa, in Southern Africa. And so by block, the continent has already moved to remove these tariff barriers. Now what we want to do is to make sure that all over the continent, this bloc can trade freely among themselves. Due to COVID-19, but also because actually tariffs are still a sensitive issue for many countries, we still don't know exactly what will be the product that will start to be liberalized in now a couple of weeks. And that already show some of the delays that the process has taken. Same thing for rules of origin, they are not all finalized. And so it means that you see in 2 weeks when the liberation should have started, right now the private sector doesn't really know what's going to happen. So not surprising here, all these trade negotiations take time, but we see that between the political will and the implementation, there is some things to do. And of course, after the removal of some tariffs, the efforts to get harmonization, or at least self-recognition of norms, in particular in terms of phytosanitary principle, we are going to have the beginning of the phase 2 of negotiation that will pave the way for a deeper integration on service, on investment, on competition policy, on intellectual property rights, that when you think about the food system and the food security and nutrition ecosystem, plays also an important role. So today I'm mainly going to focus on this first element, meaning the tariff and the tariff schedule, but just think that there is a broader agenda, and the great colleague that will talk about me will give you a deeper discussion on that. Next slide, please. So as I've said, the IFPRI itself is an important milestone in a vision for the African continent that has started, depending how you want to go back in history, but at least clearly more than 10 years. And in 2014, with the Malabo Declaration, it was also clear that there was an impetus to accelerate the agricultural trade among African countries. And one of the objectives was by 2025, and so between 2015 to 2025, triple intra-Africa trade. And we are not there yet, and we are not on track, basically. Because yes, between 2005 and 2015, actually, intra-Africa trade has quadrupled with the strong dynamism of some sub-regional groups within the continent. So it was basically a 15% increase per year. In order to achieve the Malabo Declaration, we should do between 2015 and 2025 a 12%, but the last few years have just been marked by a slowdown with a 5% increase. And actually, it's clear that we will not manage to do much better without strong policies. If you look at one of the publications done by IFPRI in collaboration with Academia 2063 and Antoine Bouet is one of the editors, called the African Agricultural Trade Monitors. You will see a lot of this information, but you will see also understand some of the challenges, meaning that actually the Africa offers on world market is quite diversified, even in terms of agricultural product. It has been diversified in the recent years. You know, it's not just the fact that Africa is exporting cocoa and tea. This picture is the past. But what we have seen is there's still a bit of mismatch between what the African demand is about and what the African supply is about. So this is why actually Africa continue to export a lot beyond the continent and import from trade partners also beyond the continent. And the question is how we can try to see this alignment between the continental demand and continental supply, and what will be the policy that will help. Next slide, please. And trade liberalization is going to be one of it. But as I have said, we are not going to see an elimination of all the tariffs. Actually, you are going to have some sensitive product that will take time to be liberalized, and subset of product, actually 3% of the product and up to 10% of the value of trade can be just excluded. And because some countries are very specialized in a few products, that can have a drastic impact on them. And what we have seen first in other trade negotiations, but what seems to be also the case for the AfCFTA is agriculture is, in relative terms, more impacted by this sensitivity than the rest of the economy. You have some food security concern, you have some political sensitivity, you still have some countries that want to have self-sufficiency, independently of where the food comes from. And therefore, we see much more of this flexibility in the negotiation that are used to limit the liberalization of agricultural markets. And that's a key revolution in terms of how policymakers have to look at this. You cannot increase regional trade if you just want to export more. By definition, some African countries will export more, maybe most of them will export more, but also some countries will need to import more. And at the end, that has to be accepted. You need to import more. You need to create market access for your partners if you want to get market access from them. Next slide, please. So when you start to put this in different models, and at IFPRI, we really focus on this question of trade, about how the sensitive product can be selected by different countries, what it means when you have RECs that have to, so regional entities that have to conciliate the different preferences for member states on that. Also, this detailed trade pattern and specialization across product, meaning that, you know, where we are going to see trade creation and trade deviation, that require a lot of details, but also how countries are going to react in terms of macroeconomic adjustment that can actually change the outcome of this trade liberalization. I'm not going to enter in all this detail now, but just to say that we try to control for that. And I'm just going to illustrate some key points. Next slide, please. So when you start to take into account this tariff liberalization and what it means just in terms of tariffs over time. And on my slide here, you see 4 lines. The one on the top is about the evolution of the agricultural tariffs. And yes, agricultural products are more protected to start with than industrial product. And actually, most of the protection may remain, because if you see the upper blue line where there is no exclusion, actually we are going to go to 0. So all the market within Africa will be liberalized. But you see, with this possibility to exclude or delay the liberation of some product, you still are going to have half of the protection that remains because it's going to be concentrated. And that, I think, one of the big challenge of the agricultural liberalization in the IFPRI. A few details can really wash a big part of the liberalization. Next slide, please. So if we look at the macroeconomic impact of the liberalization, focusing on tariffs, we have limited results. Maximum, even without a sensitive product, we may have an increase of less than 1% of real income for the countries. Actually, within countries and within the continent, you have big winners, and you have some countries that are basically not best off, but not worst off. So for some countries, the gains can be much more important, but in average, they are limited. But as soon as you introduce this product that can escape the liberalization, you see that the overall gain can be cut by more or less 2/3. So a few sensitive products can really undermine the whole process. Next slide, please. If you look at the agricultural trade dynamics within the continent, here we start from a base 100 in 2018, and you see the red, what will happen without any new policy. Clearly, we will not triple agricultural trade. And actually, with the IFPRI and without trade liberalization, we will have triple agricultural trade, not by 2025, but at least by 2035. But here also, sensitive product actually eat a big part of the potential market gain. So how we are going to make sure that over time, all the markets are integrated and really we don't have some pocket of protection that really hurt the interest of some of the partners is going to be key. Next slide, please. If I look at, of course, you can look at the export chains by countries or by group of countries here, and in terms of export and imports. And yes, you have some countries that are a group of countries that can see significant increase in the export to the African continent, 60%, 70% in terms of potential if everything is liberalized, 30, 40%, 20% with the sensitive products. So you see some countries or group of countries can be heavily impacted by this few sensitivity, but it's not homogeneous. So that's why all the negotiations have to be important. But also you have some countries that are going to increase their imports much more in terms of agricultural product than their export. Of course, they are going to export other type of product. In particular, in industry, the AfCFTA can really be a part of the industrialization process of Africa. So some countries are going to take this train, while others will expand their agriculture. Next slide, please. If we look within the agricultural sectors, and here it's about the value added in agriculture, you will see that, yes, some regions like Southern Africa can really increase their export, in particular in processed food, or North Africa. Basically, some of the most advanced economies of Africa can increase their processed exports and processed production, while others will specialize in more primary product, when other basically economies are just going to phase out a bit of agriculture and just accelerate their industrialization process. And that's why with the AfCFTA, you are going to see less agricultural growth than with, it's not a problem, it's just, you are going to evolve in terms of economic structure in the allocation of resources. Next slide, please. So in order to actually conclude, I think that we really need to see this AfCFTA becoming a reality. We have to also make sure that policymakers understand that doing more trade means to import more and to export more. That's quite important. And we have also, and that will be my final remarks, other policies will come in complement of the AfCFTA, in particular CADEP. Developing this production process is important, but also the harmonization of norms and the food safety in order to have good food quality, but market that operate in a good manner will be key. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, for that insightful presentation to set the stage. I'm happy now to pass the baton to Maryla Maliszewska. Maryla, who's a, sorry, Maryla is a senior economist at the World Bank Group. Maryla.
Thank you. So good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this seminar. Thank you to IFPRI for their kind invitation. I want to walk you through the key findings of our recent report that the World Bank has published on the Africa AfCFTA, and specifically on the economic and distributional effects of the agreement. The report is available on the website with country-specific results and all the details, so I'll try to be relatively brief. Next slide, please. So what I want to walk you through today is very briefly on the state of play, because David has already given a great introduction, focus on the economic and distributional effects, tell you a little bit more about the impacts on trade, on agricultural and food products, and maybe just to conclude with the role of AfCFTA during the pandemic and its role in terms of the recovery. What I want to stress here is that the study has been conducted at the request of the Trade Commissioner, His Excellency Muchanga, and he asked us specifically to look at the distributional effects. And for that reason, we compiled a new data set on employment and wages of female and male workers. It's by no means perfect, but it's quite comprehensive, and it's also available on the website of the report. Next slide, please. So next slide, please. Again, so I'll go very briefly on the state of play because David has already talked about it. But what I really want to stress here is that we are fully aligned in thinking that the agreement has a huge potential to diversify trade and economies of African countries. It has a huge potential to attract FDI, accelerate growth, provide new job opportunities, and reduce poverty. But of course, this all depends on the level of ambition of the forthcoming negotiation on services, the IPR, competition, investment, e-commerce, all of those measures, and of course on implementation, which is not a given. It's a long process, it's a costly process, and it's critical to the success of the agreement. So what I want to do here is to show you kind of an aspirational scenario where it could take us. But of course, it's all subject to the continued negotiations and implementation. Next slide, please. So in terms of the progress so far, what we know is that countries are supposed to start trading on January 1st, but there is still some issues that remain to be negotiated, like sensitive goods. And what we had to do in this study, we had to make some assumptions on what we believe will be the 3% sensitive goods that will be excluded from liberalization. So we followed the modality of the AfCFTA tariff liberalization that differentiates between LDCs and the group of 7 and non-LDCs, and different schedule for tariff liberalization. All I want to highlight here is that the 3% sensitive goods excluded from liberalization were selected based on the tariff revenue that they bring on the intra-AfCFTA trade. Basically, we run the goods and selected those that account for 3% of trade. So next slide, please. What else? I wanted also to highlight that the continued negotiations on commitments on trading services are critical, and we think there's a huge potential for fostering progressive liberalization based on the WTO plus positive list and the exchange of offer by member states. That really creates a potential to reduce the barriers to trade, to have a common set of rules and transparency, where the countries will commit not to put up any more barriers in terms of trade in services. So when it comes to services, it's not so much about liberalization per se in terms of reducing barriers, but in terms of committing to transparency and not increasing the barriers, but also providing all the legislation that's needed to trade in services. And next slide, please. So next slide, please. Then I want to now walk you briefly through the methodology and the new data. And I know we're slowly running out of time. So very briefly, the overview is it's a similar tool to what David was discussing. It's a computable dynamic Equilibrium model. We use it to look at the economic implications. So impact on growth, on employment, or on trade, or output by sectors. We also apply micro simulations because we were focusing on the distributional outcomes, so looking at household surveys, income distribution. We also look at the tariff revenue using partial equilibrium model, which is part of the report and might be of interest to you. We're currently working on adding the potential impacts of AfCFTA on FDI, which we believe will be critical to maximize the gains, and will bring the, well, basically our estimates were done before COVID, so this is something that needs to be very in mind, that for example, the poverty estimate, growth estimates do not take that into consideration. So at to some degree, we might be overestimating the gains. At the same time, once we add the FTI, we expect the gains to be so much more higher due to inflow of capital. And we also created the new data set on employment and wages. Let me now move on to the next slide, please, to start discussing the scenarios. I've already discussed the tariff liberalization and the reasons why we think there is a good reason to believe that if there are ambitious commitments under technical barriers to trade, SPS, there will be a reduction of non-tariff barriers involved in trade in goods and services. And in general, those are the procedures that are related to technical barriers to trade, SPS. They are there to protect consumer welfare and safety, but often the differences in those regulations or the administrative costs related with compliance are create the unnecessary burdensome barriers to trade. And we believe that AfCFTA has the potential to reduce them by 50%. This is kind of like a standard assumption for the deep agreements that go well beyond tariffs. And finally, the assumptions on the trade facilitation measures. So if you look at the chapter on trade facilitation of the AfCFTA, despite the fact that several countries are not WTO members, the chapter reminds very much the text of the WTO trade facilitation agreements. It's in its spirit. And so we believe the ambitious scenario, aspirational one, would be to assume that all countries implement those commitments in the trade facilitation annex of the AfCFTA as if they were implementing the trade facilitation agreement. And trade facilitation measures involve improving border infrastructure and reducing cost of administrative procedures. And that ultimately makes easier for African businesses to integrate into regional and global value chains. And next slide, please. So once you put those impacts together, what happens if you reduce tariffs and non-tariff measures in goods and services, and that trade facilitation? We estimate that the real income in Africa as a continent could increase by 445 billion. The way to look at this is to think of this GDP of income level of the continent in 2035 at the end of the implementation period and compare it to what it would have been without the AfCFTA. So something important to stress here that the CG model are here to provide scenario analysis to allow you to think through consequences of different policy changes, but these are not projections. This is basically what we think would happen if you have a certain baseline in mind, which is continuation of past trends, including the increases in working age population and other factors. And you get to a certain level in 2035, then you implement the trade facilitation, tariff, and NTM reductions, and you get to a higher level with the AfCFTA. There's a big heterogeneity of outcomes across countries, with countries that started with relatively high barriers gaining the most. But also it's important to note that the biggest gains come from the trade facilitation measures, then from the non-tariff measures reductions, and the gains from tariff liberalization are relatively small. And in fact, they actually, we record some losses in terms of income, but they're really, really small impacts. Next slide, please. And what I want to show you here is the potential impact of AfCFTA on trade. And what we see is that there is potential to increase total trade by up to 81% relative to what it would have been without the AfCFTA in terms of exports due to AfCFTA and members. And the biggest gains in trade with the AfCFTA members would be in manufacturing, but also significant gains in processed food and agriculture. So, for example, the boost to AfCFTA export in processed foods would be 91%, agriculture 49%. Okay, 2 minutes. And what's important to note is that some countries will export more, some countries will export less. And as David was saying, it will have different impacts across countries, but overall there is huge potential to boost intra-African trade. Next slide, please. So here we're moving into focusing on the distributional aspect. So what we find is under our assumptions, the AfCFTA has the potential to lift an additional 30 million people out of extreme poverty, which is at $1.90 a day. And what we see that the countries with high initial poverty rates will experience the greatest declines. And here what you need to bear in mind is again, that this is the additional poverty reduction as a result of AfCFTA. So we already expect a certain level of poverty reduction, which now will sadly, due to COVID, will not be as estimated over a year ago, but this is the additional 30 million people. Next slide, please. That shows you the people lifted out of the poverty at $5.50 a day. And again, half of this moderate poverty, half of the people lifted from moderate poverty will be in Ethiopia, Nigeria, Tanzania, DRC, Kenya, and Niger. And that's again a huge boost to consumption and incomes of households. That's again due to the high boost of consumption income of households as a result of AfCFTA. Next slide, please. Just briefly focusing on the skilled and unskilled workers. So basically what's happening is that the production of various countries is changing as a result of AfCFTA, leading to a reallocation of resources. And that reallocation of resources leads to boost of sectors that are either intensive in unskilled workers or female workers, as you will see on the next slide. And basically we see an increase of wages due to AfCFTA, but this increase is a little bit faster for unskilled workers and also a little bit faster for female workers. This is mostly because the industries that tend to employ these workers intensively benefit more compared to other industries. But most of the all of the type of workers, so skilled, unskilled, female, male, end up being better off. Thank you. Next slide, and the next one, because that's already been discussed. The next one, please. So very briefly, we also pull out the results on the trade in agriculture and food products, which you can see on the next slide, please. This is the annual potential growth rates of intra-African exports. And you can see the growth rate in the baseline, which is on average 15%, which interestingly overlaps with the rates, the historical rates, and it's higher under AfCFTA than in the baseline. So moving on to the next slide, please. The growth of food products is a little bit lower, but in the same range. But you have to bear in mind that these are the growth rates. So it's often when you look at the highest growth rate, they apply to countries with relatively small volume of export. So they grow quite a lot, but the starting point is low. Next slide, please. And so I want to conclude with just a couple of words about the role of AfCFTA during and post-COVID, and that's the next slide, please. Just to wrap up, we think that there is a strong there should be a strong push to pursue the AfCFTA, continued negotiation on services, and the deep commitment. Because in addition to the many benefits I've already mentioned earlier, the AfCFTA will make the countries more resistant to future shocks, whether this be climate change or, God forbid, future pandemics. But they will be stronger with the AfCFTA than without. And that will be due to enhanced regional collaboration, due to lower trade costs that will make the economies more flexible, more resilient, and more diversified. And also this is a huge opportunity to anchor expectations, which will also bring the much needed FDI boost. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maryla. We are so fortunate to have such a team of experts presenting the incredible analysis they have been doing building up to the implementation on January 1st. So we will conclude our team of expert presentations with Andrew Mould. Andrew is the Chief of Regional Integration of the AfCFTA cluster of the Office for Eastern Africa, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Andrew.
Thank you very much, Julie. Good morning or good afternoon, colleagues, wherever you are. Okay, I'm going to take you very quickly through a report our office has undertaken this past year with our colleagues in Trademark East Africa, from the perspective of Eastern Africa, looking specifically at the kind of benefits that the region stands to gain. So let me take you very quickly through some of the stylized facts, just to stress the importance, I think, of the AfCFTA for the East African region. Now, Eastern Africa is well known for being a region with relatively low per capita income. It's one of the poorest regions of Africa, but it's a very dynamic region. It's actually been one of the fastest growing regions, sub-regions in the world, up to this period of the COVID-20 crisis. You can see we had the forecast there initially, which of course have been revised dramatically downwards. Quite commonly, countries in Eastern Africa prior to COVID were also registered amongst the top 10 fastest growing countries in the world. However, in our report, we stress very much that Eastern Africa suffers from a number of vulnerabilities in terms of its growth process. Some of those are global problems, such as the COVID problem we have now. The fiscal situation in countries like Ethiopia and Kenya currently is quite serious. Environmental impacts are very serious as well in Eastern Africa. But for the purpose of this presentation, I'm just going to illustrate a couple of structural and employment challenges, which have a lot of relevance to the AfCFTA. The first thing is that when we look at the trend towards the structural diversification of the region, unfortunately, we've seen in recent years that that's stalled. If you look here on this graph on the bottom axis, we have the share of value added in services, and the share of value added in manufacturing. And if we were to see our diversification, we would see it move towards the top right-hand corner. In actual fact, we've seen services increase in a number of countries, but not manufacturing. Manufacturing has stagnated or even declined. And in a couple of cases, we actually have this perverse relation where we've got countries where both services and manufacturing have declined. Now, in the case of Tanzania, for example, that's explainable principally by primary commodity resources. In the case of Kenya, to do with its relative success in promoting horticultural exports, for example, but it's not the general trend that economists would like to see towards structural diversification. Another main challenge of the region is clearly employment. The demographic trends in the region are such that the demographic pressures in general are such that we've got a lot of people entering into the labour market every single year. In the case of Ethiopia, over 2 million people join the job market each year. In the case of DRC, Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, all over 1 million people joining the job market. So there's enormous pressure on governments and the private sector to create greater employment opportunities. At the same time, trends in intra-regional trade were doing quite well, actually. We have one of the most consolidated regional blocks in Eastern Africa, the East Africa Community, and up until 2012, the performance was very good in terms of increase in intra-regional trade. Similar story in the case of IGAD. Unfortunately, over the last 5 or 6 years, just prior to the COVID crisis, we saw a stagnation in intra-regional trade as well. And that's one of the things, of course, that the AfCFTA is designed to address. And finally, the final stylized facts is actually we've seen a quite sharp decline in intra-regional FDI as well. And again, as Maryla was saying, FDI is going to be one of the main sources of benefits for the AfCFTA going forward. So that's also a rather disappointing trend. So what is the potential of the AfCFTA for Eastern Africa region? Well, the first thing to stress is the economies, as I said, the income per capita is small, and even the countries with large populations, they have a relatively small GDP, none of them reaching more than 100 billion. That might be the wrong way to look at it, though, for small developing countries because of the adjustments that you can make. If you look at the PPP GDP, you'll see that the economies experience a very significant adjustment upwards in the size of their markets. And if we take the PPP measure of regional GDP, by approximately next year, we were calculating just prior to the crisis, we'd have to revise that down a bit, but the regional economy would be worth $1 trillion. So it's quite a substantial market amongst the 14 countries of Eastern Africa. And yet, there's a lot of pent-up consumer demand in the region, but it's being met principally by imports in the region. A lot of that is being met by imports. If you look at the trade balance, we've seen exports have increased over the last 2 decades, but imports have been increasing generally much faster. And as a subsequent consequence of this, we see trade balances which are very strongly negative and large current account deficits. When we looked into which sectors were driving these trade imbalances, we actually just did that disaggregation by sector of the trade balance. It wasn't in food trade, actually. You do see some countries are net food importers in a sub-region, quite large ones in some cases. A couple of countries are net exporters of food as well. Agricultural raw materials, it was fairly balanced. Fuels, the region's a net fuel importer on aggregate. There are some countries which are mineral wealthy, so the DRC, Tanzania, for example, net exports. But where you clearly see these trade deficits that are being generated is in manufactured goods, very large deficits in manufactured goods. And that's why we feel that the AfCFTA will be a very important step forward. If you look at the composition of regional trade for the region, for example, currently you see that manufactured goods to the rest of the world represent less than 1/5 of total exports. But when you look at the intra-regional component, it's closer to half. And for the East Africa community, I've seen figures going up to 2/3 of the intra-regional trade is manufactured. And that includes processed foods as well. So you can appreciate that if you wish to accelerate the diversification of the economies, it looks like the regional route is the way to go. Also, in our report, we just briefly point out the high profitability in a lot of the sectors which will be liberalized under the AfCFTA. Some of those are in service related, ICT, communications, but agribusiness, food and drink are also sectors where you've got high rates of profitability. So you would expect in the future, with a liberalization of intra-African investment flows, greater investment into the region as well. So that's the stylized facts about why it would be important. Our own assessment of the AfCFTA for Eastern Africa was based on GTAB. It was a fairly standard modeling exercise in terms of the model closure and shocks that were applied. We get much smaller welfare gains than the ones that Maryla is reporting. That's partially due to the fact that it's a dynamic model that she's discussing there. We actually use just a simple static model there. And we were doing it partially in response to the request from member states to have a clearer idea about which sectors were going to be impacted. So we were particularly interested in the sectorial chain. We calculated approximately $1 billion in new intra-regional exports due to it. We calculated out of the model approximately 2 million additional jobs created by the AfCFTA, and other benefits would come through services and labor-intensive manufacturers. So just to stress, and I think this is where Maryla's study is of particular interest, we didn't include NTBs in our modelling or trade facilitation measures. And clearly quite a lot of the benefits are going to hinge on those. And nor did we model increased services trade. And it's an interesting point that Eastern Africa is actually quite strong in services trade. A number of countries actually have positive service trade balances, whereas they have very large negative merchandise trade imbalances. So services is an important area. So in terms of the sectors in our modeling scenario, granted that we didn't include services there, you see that it tends to be manufacturing sectors such as processed food, textiles and clothing, light manufacturing, which are the ones which benefit most, and those tend to be the most labor-intensive sectors. So that's a very good message in terms of helping, in terms of addressing some of these employment challenges. And the one question comes up whenever we present these results, of course, is from government parties concerned about tariff revenue loss. And there we stress that our modeling scenarios here don't suggest it's going to be a major problem. Tariff revenue has anyway been declining as a percentage of government revenues over the recent decades. And as a percentage share of total government revenues, it's really quite small. So the largest loss there would be 1.3% of total government revenue for Tanzania. But for the other countries, it was under 1%. And let me finalize this presentation just with some quick anecdotal examples of the kind of impacts on the ground that we could see from the AfCFTA. So IATA conducted a study, for example, talking about greater air service sector liberalization, where they were estimating an additional 50,000 jobs for Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda. There was a study undertaken by World Bank colleagues on creating an Eastern African digital market, where they talked about anywhere between 1.6 and 4.5 million additional new jobs. And from our office, we're also very insistent on the message about the importance of the free movement protocol, because a lot of countries in our region complain of job shortages in terms of skilled workers, at the same time where we know there's a lot of unemployed graduates. So we feel very strongly the free movement protocol will also help address some of the skills constraints and joblessness across the continent. In terms of energy and food security, regional power pools, there's a lot of work being undertaken in this area at the moment. The Grand Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia, for example, the ability to export more widely across the region. You often see it reported that actually there's quite a lot of trade. A lot of it hasn't started yet from the Grand Renaissance Dam, but it's on tap. It should be starting fairly in the coming years now. Lower fuel import bills. Ethiopia itself imports most of its fuel from the Middle East, but there was a calculation that if it sourced a lot of its oil from neighboring South Sudan, it could cut its annual fuel import bill by about 15–20%. And finally, more inter-regional trade in food. Uganda, for example, is one country where already more than 50% of its trade is with the continent, even prior to the implementation of the AfCFTA. And it's actually started to catch up and overtake Kenya in terms of being the leading trader within the East Africa community. And that's principally on the back of its agricultural trade. There is some diversified products in there, but it's a lot to do with its position as a food producer for the region. And very finally, this is to quote, these figures I believe come from Maryla's study. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but just to show you here that these are the benefits coming from her study in terms of the welfare changes just due to tariff changes. But at the minute you start adding NTMs on the reduction of non-tariff barriers measures and then trade facilitation, you see that the benefits are greatly enhanced. So I think it really makes the case very strongly for increased trade facilitation measures to accompany the implementation of the AfCFTA. And that's precisely why from our office in Eastern Africa, we have a strong partnership with Trademark East Africa, which has mobilized an additional $150 million US to help with the trade facilitation in the region under the AfCFTA. So the take homes, just to finish, I hope I've not overrun my time. We see that Eastern Africa has pockets of good practice in terms of regional integration within the EAC, for example, but it's not well integrated into the wider African economy. We feel that the AfCFTA will help fill the gaps that exist currently where there are remaining tariffs, something that David was talking about in his presentation. There are still a lot of non-tariff barriers being applied. So, for example, DRC is not a member of the COMESA free trade area, nor is Ethiopia. And the AfCFTA will help tackle that. We believe that the AfCFTA will also act as a catalyst for existing projects of regional integration, such as the EAC, because it will be tackling precisely non-tariff barriers and trade facilitation as well. I think it will help focus minds on the importance of the regional integration agenda. And finally, the AfCFTA effectively needs to be inclusive to be effective. And we need to do a lot more work in terms of carrying the message to the general public about the potential gains for this, because all the surveys we've been undertaking in the development of national strategies recently suggest the private sector is complaining it doesn't really know a lot about it. It's got a very vague idea. And if you go to the general public, the level of awareness is very low. So I think we've got to do a lot of work in that area as well. So that's a summary of the report that you can find online as well. And I'd just like to thank IFPRI for the opportunity to participate in this interesting dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and to all of our speakers for presenting a breadth of different analysis that has been done leading up to this report. I want to encourage all of our listeners to submit your questions. A reminder that you can do it directly on the event website, as well as using the hashtag AskIFPRI on Twitter or through LinkedIn or Facebook. I want to kick off with a question for David Laborde. Concerning the sensitive products clause, what were some of the criterion of selection of sensitive products, and were there more important criterion for selecting sensitive products, such as their impact on public revenues, things like that? David.
So thanks for the question. It's a very important one in all trade negotiations. The devil is in the detail. In the result I have shown, we have a political economy model that we calibrate to select this product. Because actually, if you, for example, you take tariff revenue, if you have a very high tariffs that block any imports, you don't collect tariff revenue. It can be very sensitive for you, but it will not appear in terms of fiscal impact. So that's why we actually combine this kind of extended political economy model to do the selection. But by no way we are sure that the model will actually give us the list that the country will select. Okay, just assumption, model-based. What we are trying to do is to show, based on the revealed preferences of the country so far in trade negotiation and in framing their trade policy, what they were used to select a sensitive product, and that's what we project. Just, of course, in a consistent way, meaning that when an African country, let's say like Morocco, is going to liberalize or has liberalized with Europe or with the USA, or when they are going to liberalize with the rest of the continent, of course, their list of products is not the same because the potential of competition is not the same. So that's what we try to factor in. Now, different countries clearly have different way to do this aggregation, both in terms of what the government is focusing on. And yes, the Ministry of Finance focuses on tariff revenue losses, but the Ministry of Agriculture has some specific value chain they want to protect. You have also the social impact and a number of products also that are important for health can be liberalized in priority, even if so far, for instance, they were representing some important tariff revenue, because we still have in some countries this pattern. But something that is quite challenging is we have already a number of custom union in Africa, and they already have built a common external tariff, either in East Africa, in West Africa, in Central Africa, and they have to come also with a consistent list of sensitive products for the IFCFTA. And that has not been done everywhere. So you have still countries that will come with their list of sensitive products with the IFCFTA that may have not been fully harmonized with their neighbor, and why it takes so much time, and why we need in the coming weeks to have all the offers on the table, see how these schedules have been delivered, and hopefully we will see in the coming years adjustment and still negotiation to make sure that most of these roadblocks will be removed in the future. Because from a trade negotiation point of view, if people do not agree to remove a 5% tariff, don't believe that they will remove a big regulation that creates a 50% NTM. If it is so sensitive politically, they will keep protective measure until the end.
David, we have a quick follow-up question from Steve Land at the President of Manchester Trade about if not all of those common external tariffs, those within the custom unions, if those aren't clarified, how will the AfCFTA operate on January 1st if those things haven't been settled?
So I'm going to be very politically incorrect. On January 1st, not a lot is going to happen. We are going to see several years. we are going to see some product liberalized, but countries are going first to say that, we already have liberalized some product, even on an MFN basis. So that's partly done for the intra-regional trade. That's from a purely accounting point of view, that's true. But we are going to see things happening during the year, still starting to figure out what is happening. And it will take 2, 3, 4 years before we really see an acceleration of the process. We should not be naive. It's always like this, especially in a situation where, with COVID-19 this year, there was some delays, some meetings were not be able to be implemented. And last but not least, we are going to see some specific question with third parties, because you have also some African countries that have signed trade agreements with people outside the African continent. And this agreement, there is what we call the MFN clause, meaning that if a country like, I'm just going to take Morocco because it's a very advanced economy that have already some trade partners, in the agreement with the US, there is a specific regulation that say, or if you give a lower tariff to any partner, you should also give it to the US, even if it was sensitive for the US. So you are going to see wave of lawyers that will start to look at that. And that's why I think these schedules are going to adjust. But yes, in 2 weeks, it's not going to be the revolution. We are going to see an evolution, but that was also monitoring and accountability is so important in the process.
Great, thank you so much, David. Question from one of our IFPRI colleagues for Maryla. Your poverty impact estimates, we're wondering, are those net impact? And then maybe, Andrew, you can also touch on this from your study as well, meaning that there will be people getting out of poverty, but also people that may be becoming poor if they have lost income as a result of competing with imports. And so do you have a gross impact as well, if it is an impact? Maryla.
Yeah, that's true. That's a net impact as a result of IFCFTA. So we already have some assumed poverty reduction in the baseline due to the growth rates and changes in income distribution that we foresee. Yes, the limitation of the CGE model in some way is that the way we run it, there is no unemployment. So all new labor market entrants find productive employment. So of course, there will be temporary job losses as people find new jobs. But overall, we believe that with the faster growth and reallocation of labor force from less to more productive industries, there is potential to accommodate those workers that could potentially lose jobs due to import competition. But because of the way the model is set up, we don't have the estimated kind of temporary unemployment. But we definitely have the numbers in the report that tell you about how many people need to switch jobs. And I don't remember it on top of my head, but yes, we have this job switching across sectors that could temporarily lead to job losses. But the assumption in the model is that eventually people are able to relocate to the sectors that are expanding in their countries.
Great, thanks so much, Maryla. Andrew, well, a follow-up to Maryla, is there any built into the model, any ability to assess how difficult those switches can be, if it's a large geographic difference or if a difference in skills?
No, that's a very good question, and it's actually of course it's a very important issue, and at everyone on the policymakers' mind. If you look at trade policy changes, what will be the distributional effects like within countries? And this is something that we've done the report at the continental level, where it's hard to dig deeper into country-specific results, but we're beginning to work with countries to fine-tune the assumptions, to tell us more what they think they are going to get out of the agreements in the coming years in terms of commitments, in terms of goods and services, and fine-tuning the analysis to look at the subnational impact. And the database that we have prepared also has the regional component. So for several countries, you can dig deeper into subnational results. We're going to start with Ghana, and just continue in collaboration or in dialogue with the government, fine-tune the simulation. So all researchers, looking into it now have access to better information to conduct that analysis. But in terms of the job switching costs, they're not part of our estimates in the model in this current report. But I encourage everyone to look at the gender disaggregated labor database and dig deeper into subnational components. We've developed a methodology to do it. We've applied it recently to another study for Sri Lanka, and we're planning to do it going forward for countries that we work directly with.
Great, thank you so much, Maryla. Andrew, do you have anything to add to that question from the Eastern Africa perspective?
Yeah, well, I'd just say a general point. I mean, it's complicated to communicate with the general public what the potential gains are from the AfCFTA, and of course they often get a bit confused by the different modeling techniques that we have. I wrote a paper over a decade ago with Professor Agustin Fosu, actually, where we were pointing out that even from multilateral liberalization, African countries were starting to notice that, you know, the model were not providing such large gains as they had been initially. And that was for a number of reasons, because the databases were improved, for example, to incorporate preferential market access. And that hadn't been the case, you know, when we were talking about the Uruguay round and those first CG models, which were very much popular in the early 90s. So there is an important issue about communication, about how the benefits will actually manifest themselves. And that's why in our report, we mixed it a little bit, talking about some of these anecdotal studies and sector-specific studies where we felt that there were very strong gains to be had by creating those regional markets.
Great, thank you. This question is about other global free trade agreements have had to revise agreements in order to include environmental or labor protections due to sometimes exploitation that can happen of environmental or labor resources under initial agreement, and wondering if the AfCFTA has built in any kind of regulations to help prevent any of those such abuses from happening at its initiation. So Andrew, I maybe will think about the Eastern Africa perspective and then maybe open up to Maryla and David if we have time.
Yes, thanks very much. Yes, that question's also come up in presentations about, you know, the labor rights. I pointed out at the time, we're early stages with the AfCFTA. If the parallel, for example, the best parallel with the Europe is the European Single Market Programme. Well, it took the Europeans, you know, 3 or 4 decades before they started thinking of a social chapter really to the European integration process. So I think there may be discussions going forward in the future about this, but at the current stage, it's focused on achieving the liberalisation, both in trade and services. And as David pointed out, it won't be a big bang on the 1st of January. It's going to be a process, and it's going to take place over a period of 10, 15 years before the full market, continental market is achieved. So yes, there's currently no direct provisions that talk to that. So we'd have to rely both on corporate social responsibility on the one side, and then also on national member states legislation.
Great, thank you. We just have time probably for one more question, but Nalishebo, Maryla, or David, if you wanted to just add anything to that question.
Just maybe one thing in the sense that, you know, we talk about the AfCFTA, maybe beyond it, there is the African Union that have a larger policy agenda, you know. So when you have a trade agreement between, let's say, South Korea and the US, you don't have an overall political framework or policy framework, and you try to put in the trade agreement different issues that can change the interaction and the economic relation between the two. Here in Africa, we have broader initiatives that normally should take care of this, and that's why you didn't need to force feed everything in a trade agreement.
Thank you, David. I want to ask one final question that has come up about informal trade, and I understand, Andrew, I don't believe that that factors into the Eastern Africa model, but Maryla, wondering whether or not any of that factors in and how that informal trade might modify some of the conclusions of these reports.
Well, yes, it would indeed, Julie. It's a very good question, because actually I often feel that we talk down intra-African trade too much. We often commonly cite these figures talking about 17% of intra-African trade is intra-African trade. Now, there's two reasons why that's underestimating the importance of intra-African trade. Firstly, we have some large commodity exporters, and obviously that biases the figures. So, for example, of the 450 billion US dollars of exports from the African continent a year, at its peak, a country like Angola alone was exporting 60, 70 billion of oil. And of course, that makes it look like African trade is highly undiversified and very little with the continent. But if you strip those kind of primary commodity exports out of the figures, you suddenly see that the intra-African trade component is much more important. And it's not exceptional, the level of intra-African trade, if you compare it with South America. Mercosur, for example, also has very low levels, and they're commodity exporters, but they're pretty diversified and much higher income countries than we see in Africa. So I think that's one thing to bear in mind. You know, the commodity picture just distorts the relative importance of intra-African trade. And the second point is the informal sector trade, which is not taken into account often. Surveys in our region show that informal trade is equivalent to 10, 15, 20% of exports. And so suddenly you go for a situation where you haven't got a 17 or 20% of intra-African trade. If you add on the informal sector trade as well, you're suddenly already in the 30s. Understanding it starts to look a little bit more normal. So I think the way that we account for intra-African trade is not quite right, and we undervalue it sometimes, the extent to which it is important to local regional economies.
Maryla, is there anything you'd like to add before we pass it off to Anton, who's also an expert in inter-Africa or informal trade?
No, I couldn't agree more that that's the part of the story that we're missing, and it's critical to the distributional aspect, as some estimates shows that 80% of the small-scale traders are women, and that's their main source of livelihood. But I think just to add to what Andrew was saying, that we need to continue with the data efforts to build the evidence, but also in the long run, one would anticipate as the trade cost goes down, those trade facilitation measures and that are implemented, reducing the cost of crossing the border and the administrative burden of trading, then part of that informal trade will be brought into the formal channels. And that's something to bear in mind as an additional benefit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maryla. And I'm glad to pass it off now for some closing remarks to Antoine Bouet, who is a senior research fellow at IFPRI. Antoine.
Well, thank you very much to the three discussants for a very interesting webinar. I think that we have now a more complete perspective on the potential implications of the AfCFTA. And I'm really happy with the last questions concerning informal trade, because I think that it is a very important phenomenon in Africa. And I think that it is underestimated. And I really think that it is a direction of research which is really important in order to really understand what could be the potential implications of the AfCFTA, to take into account informal trade. Of course, I know that it's not easy, but I guess that one really important thing concerning Africa is data. We don't have enough high quality data, and this is really an investment that we must take in the coming years. Also, I think that the agreement will have another implications, which is also really important. It has been mentioned by the three speakers. African trade, particularly in agriculture, is marked by specialization and exports in the unprocessed sector and imports of semi-processed and processed products. And if we look in detail at the structure of trade, and this is what the AATM report, which is done by IFPRI and Academia 2063, we can see that the specializations of African exports in unprocessed products is especially strong in its trades with the rest of the world, with out of Africa. And while if you look at trade between African countries today, it was also mentioned by Andrew and David, this is more balanced, and there are more semi-processed and processed products. And we even see now the beginning of an interesting phenomenon, which is the fact that there are some African countries that import raw products from other African countries. It has been mentioned also by Andrew, and they transform it, and David, and they transform it and they re-export something. So it's really an important phenomenon, because it looks like there are regional value chains that are taking place progressively. And of course, this is a very interesting process in terms of gains in competitiveness, and in particular in the future to gain in terms of exports to the rest of the world. I would like to mention that there will be some political resistance to the AfCFTA, not only at the level of countries, but also within countries. And this is why I think that not only active accompanying measures are important, like trade facilitations to amplify the gain from trade liberalization, but also passive measures, accompanying measures, like, for example, to help people that work in import competing sectors to face this shock, which is really important. So I think that I would like to thank again the three discussants, and also Julie, who has done a terrific job, and Nalishebo also for this really interesting introduction. I wish you the best, and take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you again to everyone for joining us. I want to remind our audience that IFPRI has one last seminar of 2020 on Thursday, December 17th. Please join us for that. And then thank you again to all of our speakers for, I think we've really captured just how complicated this is and how important the research of places like the World Bank, UNECA, IFPRI are as the negotiations continue for this agreement. Thank you, everyone, and have a great evening, morning, or afternoon. Bye-bye.